Okay, this is a continuation of the self-forgiveness that I'm doing now that I'm in the middle of separation, to assist me, myself, and you as all life. And this forgiveness list I've been doing since I separated, and just experimenting what effect it has on my emotions. And what I noticed is that it has helped me tremendously to come to face with who really me is, the self, and how the mind plays out in terms of emotions and feelings. And so, from the point of view of separation from everything and everyone else, as me, as identified as me, as separate from everything and everyone else because I have a different form, I've looked at it from the point of view of oneness and equality as the life essence, or the spirit, or the life force that we all are. And the way I do that is do this self-forgiveness. Okay, so I found this from the internet, from www.destiny.co.za, and it's also in my website, www.onenessanequalityaslife.ning.com. Click on the groups, look for the group called Self-Forgiveness List Done 10 times or 10x. Click on June and the links will be there for you. Okay, so to continue, I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from creation. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from nature. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from humanity. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from the animal kingdom. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from existence. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from my human physical body. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to separate myself from the universe. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the breath. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the wind. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from water. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the clouds. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the rain. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the atom. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from the molecule. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself here. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to separate myself from all that I see and observe with physical eyes, interpreting that which I see as pictures separate from me, instead of realizing that the manifested expression of creation as me of life. I forgive myself to have allowed myself to fear taking self-responsibility for me in every moment of me as me. So instead of living, applying and expressing self-responsibility and facing myself as all that I accepted and allowed to exist with me as me, I hide and cower behind the existence of a hopeful, greater, separate source, so that I don't have to deal with what exists within me as me. I forgive myself that I haven't allowed myself to realize that hope, faith, and belief is manifested connectors the mind used to the relationships with separate manifestations within of the unified consciousness field, which loop me into enslavement. which lock me into enslavement of the mind within and as the unified consciousness field, within and as separation. Let's have a look if there's some more. Okay. So, I forgive myself that I haven't allowed myself to realize that hope, faith, and belief is manifested connectors the mind uses to the relationships with separate manifestations within and of the unified consciousness field, which lock me into enslavement of the mind within and as a unified consciousness field, within and as separation. I forgive myself that I haven't allowed myself to realize that relationships exist of the mind. The mind cannot exist without relationships. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to think and believe. I need, require, want, and desire relationship to have the ability to survive and exist in this world, to be of worth, to be someone, to be noticed, and to be appreciated. I forgive myself that I have allowed myself to want, need, and desire to be loved, because I haven't accepted myself within and as oneness and equality as me as the breath of life. Cool, that is the end of it. Let me just tell you that after every self-forgiveness video, I do breath awareness, which is what I do is I close my eyes, I focus on my breath as I breathe in, pause, breathe out, pause. And I do that for 20 times. So cool. This is the end, by the way, of this self-forgiveness for God. Okay? Cool.